people depressed. I'm here showing people we can win, showing people we can take action, but that people need to be upset. They need to be, instead of depressed, angry and get out of their comfort zones and get angry enough to stand there with a sandwich board about how we're in a police state, or to call into talk radio, or set up a website, or go to city council, or call their congressman, or dump their stock in these body scanning companies. I bet a lot of you own stock in these through 401ks and mutual funds that don't even know it. That we're not going to put up with these body scanners, that we're going to say no, that we know their strategy of incrementally rolling them out, so we understand the conditioning. We need to say no now. Okay, but Max, make your point about this.
Right. It's an excellent interview. He makes some great points, and it's a great stepping off place for a discussion. And let me just add one quick comment to what you're saying. You know, this whole idea of boycotts that you've mentioned. You know, I have always believed that the best way to fight the speculators and the rogue capitalists is to come up with a way to beat them at their own game. And in the area of boycotts, if you look at all those companies out there, there's actually a way to figure out which one is the most vulnerable to a boycott and then take that approach. So in other words, instead of trying to finesse it, you take the approach of you want to win, and you want to win big, and you apply the same dirty tactics that's being applied to us against them. And I've done all the work on this, and I'll be happy to talk to you about it, after the break or whatever you want to do.
Well, here's the issue, and I'm not saying that isn't a good plan, but we need multifaceted plans. A lot of people don't have the money to go try to short these people, or the system has the tens of trillions that the central banks give them. That's how they're able to leverage and manipulate. Though, look at gold. They've been trying to suppress it, but they've been largely unsuccessful. So I think a general knowledge, a general understanding of this, that things are going to get worse if we don't stand up. I mean, I don't think it's... Hold on just a second, Max. Let me finish my statement here. This is important. Okay, there is a certain percentage of the population, 25, 30% from what I've researched on the Stockholm Syndrome and other similar syndromes, that when they're being abused, they roll over and defend the abuse. But 70% or more don't. 5% won the Revolutionary War against King George III. So my issue is, if I see a neighbor's house on fire and I run over and knock on their door and say your house is on fire, if 25% run in and start loving the flames, saying, I'll hug the flames, I'll love it, that will make the fire go away, or, oh, I'm going to roast weenies, it's okay, because they decide to play the mental trick of Crime Stop that Orwell talked about, and they decide to just submit to it and to just go along with it. That's their fault if 25, 30% do that. I'm not looking for the cowardly jellyfish that hear this and just go, oh, shucks, I'm going to accept it. I'm here telling people we have a duty to our children to say no to this, Max.
Okay. The problem, as I see it, with a multiple front attack is that you needlessly dilute your impact. You remember Bruce Lee in the 1-inch punch? You know, he's very famous for the 1-inch punch. Is there a 1-inch punch that we can use to topple one of these banksters, one of these fraud companies? I believe there is, by instead of having a multiple head strategy that could be dilutive, to focus our energy onto one single point of vulnerability and to kick it so hard that it causes such an effect that it starts to rebalance the playing field. And I believe.
Well, Max, I don't think that's a bad idea. I think it's great. I think educating people about the types of stocks and bonds they own, and to really morally do research and not immorally invest in biometrics and body scanners and police state implements, and to invest in organic food, true local sustainability, that the system creates fake counterfeits for. I think that as a process is good, but the system has said they're not going to let their 4 or 5 big powerhouses go down, too big to fail. But we'll hear your 1-inch punch idea or solution after we play this video clip with the doctor you were interviewing about this victimhood psychology. Here it is. We'll be right back.
Having me.
All righty. Now, Dr. Levine, your latest article for alternate.org is titled, Are Americans a Broken People? Why We've Stopped Fighting Back Against the Forces of Oppression. Now, explain this a little bit. Why are, in this piece, explain what it means to be a broken people, and can you go through the signs of a broken people, and what would a nation of broken people look like?
I think one sign would be that when people actually know a lot of the truths about how they're being oppressed. So, for example, when you have a society, American society, that, if not the majority, depending on what polls you're looking at, but certainly a significant, many millions, and probably a majority who don't understand why the heck we're even in these wars that we're in, a majority of people who want a much more humane health coverage system, if not single payer, at least some healthy public option. I mean, you have huge numbers of people out there who know the truth, how they're being oppressed, victimized, and they're not acting on that. And that, for me, reminds me of a lot of people, individuals I know who are, for example, with spouses who are emotionally or physically or sexually abusing them. They know their spouses are bad news, they're horrible, they're oppressive, but they can't. They feel helpless and hopeless to do something about that. So I think the hallmark sign of when you're seeing somebody in whatever you would want to call it. We don't need to use psychology jargon. You could just call it beaten, broken people. We don't call it abuse syndrome. You can call it whatever the heck you want. But there's a certain kind of thing that happens when people are completely dispirited, that that more truths about how they're getting oppressed really are not going to free them up.
Okay, so abuse syndrome is, it sounds a little bit like Stockholm Syndrome, if you will. Famously a situation where the captor falls in love with the person who's keeping them hostage. Patty Hearst being a famous example of this. So you're saying the entire country, the United States, is suffering from abuse syndrome, and that the people in charge, like Obama and the rest of his crew, are like the abusive pimps or the abusive spouse who are just beating the poor victim, who then becomes completely demoralized. And there's a self-feeding phenomenon, and there's an aspect to this which is very, very interesting. You say in a recent piece here, can people become so broken that the truths of how they are being screwed do not, quote, set them free, but instead further demoralize them? And the reason I bring this up is that in the U.S., there are media outlets, let's say Alex Jones, who does a job in exposing how Americans are getting screwed. He does on his site brilliantly. But according to the abuse syndrome, you're saying that this is actually making the situation worse, because every time more abuse is exposed and nothing happens, it causes further demoralization as part of a feedback loop. Am I getting this correct?
Yeah, a couple of things there. One is just like, the Stockholm Syndrome that you mentioned I don't think that's happening for all Americans. That's in that syndrome, people actually fall in love with their abusers. I don't think, that there's a lot of people on the left who've fallen in love with Dick Cheney and George W. Bush, although,
sorry to interrupt, but Obama has a cult worshiping crowd. They are in love with Obama. He can do no wrong at sites like the Daily Cross.
Right.
The Daily Cross, he can't do any wrong. But you're saying that they could be victims of abuse syndrome.
Right. I think the hallmark of it is that if somebody is giving one of the classic things of somebody who is an abusive pimp or an abusive spouse is that they don't always beat the heck out of somebody. Sometimes they bring you flowers. But at bottom, if you're being not who you are is not being taken seriously, what your needs are not being taken seriously. And basically what all that's going on a regular basis is that person who is in control, whether it's a pimp or a government leader or a boss or whomever, are exploiting you. Then you're in an abuse syndrome. People can claim it's or I can see almost anything going on in our government here in the last 30 years is that people are in that kind of a syndrome where they're really getting nothing for their taxes here, except these militaries that are fighting wars all over the world that many Americans don't even understand why they're doing it.
Okay, you say bringing flowers can be a form of abuse, but to be more specific, I think this plays into your thought about the medicalization of the abuse syndrome. So instead of getting flowers, people are getting meds. Could you speak about this a little bit?
Yeah, I think my industry. I'm in the mental health profession here in the U.S. I'm a psychologist, and I spend a good part of that article confronting what my business, which is not so much a profession, a business these days, and what they've done to contribute it. And I think they've contributed to the abuse syndrome in many ways. They've taken a lot of our most potentially rebellious and non-compliant young people out there and labeled them with all kind of diseases. The most obvious being something called oppositional defiant disorder, disorder, which is an increasingly popular diagnosis here in the United States for kids who just argue with adults, who refuse to comply with adults, who are stubborn.
How odd.
So yeah, I mean, I'm not being facetious here. I'm not joking about that. That's going on. And they're increasingly subject to medication, drugs, and behavior modifications. But there's even a larger group of, I think, folks who are being described as mentally ill who are engaged in what I would call more of a passive rebellion. So there's millions of kids out there who are bored in boring schools who just don't pay attention because it's not interesting for them. They're not getting anything out of it. And so they're being labeled with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And so you got millions more who are just depressed, completely depressed, because their lives are completely alienating. They hate what they're doing for a living. They're working on jobs only to hold on to health insurance. Their lives are miserable. And so, they're medicalized with a mental illness.
Okay.
And
that's the first part of the clip. The second part's up on maxkeiser.com.